Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or morning. My name is Nima Vazendel. I head up business development here at Xona. Xona Systems, we've developed the industry's first zero trust remote operations platform for critical infrastructures, systems, and networks. Today's webinar will discuss demystifying zero trust to protect connected assets in OT, presented by Peter Gregel. Peter is a veteran in IT security operations and architecture. He's an expert with more than 20 years of experience and has led projects at some of the largest security and hardware vendors, specializing in US government intelligence operations. He has served in the military and has extensive experience deploying mission-critical systems for the US government and critical infrastructures around the world. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll also have time for Q&A at the end. Now, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Nima. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. So today we're going to talk about zero trust in the context of OT networks. So traditionally today, and in previous times, we've been approached with a castle and moat methodology for securing networks. And this basically means when you get onto the target network of your choice, for instance, let's say you guys have a gas well, with multiple HMIs located internally on that network. We connect in and we pretty much have full access to everything within that space and within that zone. We're trying to move away, as a whole, and everybody that operates in technology is trying to move away from this older antiquated method of securing the network, because we need to basically isolate and come up with an improved design that compartmentalizes everything and secures every single component in that network. We have to treat these networks as something that is exposed and assume that threats always exist. You can kind of look at it from the perspective of when we go out and deploy these networks, we really need to make sure that each component is secure enough that we can pretty much leave it exposed and not have to worry about breaches, because when a breach does occur, we can limit the damage. So some of the core things, right, are continuous monitoring and verification of each connection to each of those IT assets. And just making sure we have good design throughout. Now, with the castle analogy, right? So we typically have a castle moat mentality, right? Where we go in, we cross the moat, we're in the castle, we have access to everything. Now, as we move on from that, we look at the castle from the point of trust and who's inside, right? So now that we've moved on, we've made the castle evolve. We have a baker, we have a blacksmith, we have the keep, and we want to make sure that each person has access to each component of that castle, and only access to that. So we don't want the blacksmith in the bakery, we don't want the baker in the keep, and we don't want we don't really necessarily want the king to be roaming throughout also. We want to keep everybody where they need to be. Now this kind of goes by, just because a person is perceived as trustworthy doesn't mean we treat them as such. So basically we have a trust no one mentality. So treat every asset and design every asset as if it was going to be touched by someone that's not trusted. So also, we go into environments all the time where there might already be a breach. There might already be someone in that environment. So we need to be able to go in there and lock that environment down and start preventing, further damage, if necessary, if that's the case, and provide, a means to start locking everything down. In zero trust, POLP, principle of least privilege, is a core concept. So this is basically says, hey, I have these assets out there. I'm only going to give access to these assets with people with a need to know. So some of the ways we do this are deploying good security practices like multi-factor authentication, YubiKeys. So YubiKey is a hardware token that we could use that basically creates a one-time password. You put it in your device that you're accessing, your asset through. So it could be like your iPad, your laptop, and that provides a two-factor identity search. So this goes back to using like strong cryptography, right? Secure cell or SSL certificates with your specific identity installed on your device. This also prevents interception on, because we have to have a strong SSL handshake in place. So for that secure connection to that asset or to whatever we're connecting that asset from. One-to-one connection enforcement too. So this gives us opportunity to actually interact with who's connecting to our assets. So a lot of times we're out in the field. I have an engineer who might be working on a gas pump somewhere or something. He needs to access the resource. He might be a contractor and he's like, hey, I don't have access to this normally. So I could put him in a waiting room scenario, right? Where he goes in, connects from his device, which I really don't have any control over, but I'm giving him access to an interface to access our device. And I place him in a waiting room until I give him the authorization to access the device at a specific time, which provides a policy in place for his guest access at that time. So we're basically taking, instead of traditionally letting this person go in, connect to the network, and then have access to everything on there with no logging or auditing, I'm taking this and restricting his access to a very narrow pipe and only to what he needs to access at that time. So this is some of the views like that we provide with our product. So we have an admin view and a user view of what it looks like. So if, for instance, say one of our guests here wanted to access one of our resources, I could give them access through the product. The admin view on the left is what I would be presenting with when you request access, and the view on the right is what you would be presented with on your client device until I would give you that explicit access. Now, this is just one of many ways to do this. This is based off of, scenarios where people might need to like radio in and say, hey, I need, authorization to get into this network, and that could be that's like another factor of letting people into the network and giving them authorization for that specific time. Again, since I've explicitly done this, I have a lot of control over who connects to what, and I have, a lot of logging and a lot of, a lot of auditing involved to make sure that if anything does go wrong or if they did anything, that we'd have accountability for that. This goes into, just auditing in general too. So we have a zero trust environment. We pretty much trust no one on the network. We don't really trust our assets either, because the assets themselves that we're connecting to may not have very good security policies involved. A lot of these devices out there, especially in OT, don't have very strong security. They don't have very good logging enabled. They're there to do a purpose. They're there to control a turbine. They're there to control, electrical equipment. We're not really, they're not really designed with security in mind and auditing, in mind. They're not for the IT department. What we want to do though is enable more logging of that with the information we have. So we can still collect telemetry from these devices. We can collect detailed logs. We could do video screens, video captures of when that user connects to that asset using a connection software like ours. We could do network capture, since now we're controlling the pipes between those assets over, IP. And we could also provide more detailed system logs. Also, non-repudiation, proof of origin, right? We want to make sure the right person's connecting to the right asset, and we want proof of that, to make sure everything is in order. So when you do this, if someone else were to try to like side saddle or try to, connect to that same connection, we'd be able to detect that right away, because now we know what's in the known. And we also know that if anything's not fitting that profile, it's something that could be a breach or could be, a scenario that we need to take care of. And even with this, this goes back to, video and screen recording. It's good for training. It's good for further events. It's good for accountability. When we go back in, if we had a breach or if we had something happen, the more data we have, the better. With zero trust too, you really need to think about your attack surface. So nowadays with everything, on the IT side, we have everything in the cloud, everything's out there floating around. We have services everywhere. People don't really use VPNs as much anymore. And this makes your attack surface wide open. So if this isn't managed, we could have big problems, right? Where, you have a development system online. You might even have, like a building control system that might be on the internet, publicly exposed over port 80 that's online. So we want to reduce that attack surface as best as possible. So when we go through and we audit the network, we want to make sure like, hey, are these protocols isolated? So, what we mean by that is basically making sure like, hey, if we have port 80, we need to make sure that that's isolated. We need to make sure it's separate. We need to make sure at a minimum, at least get it up to SSL standard, or at least make sure that there's another step involved to connecting to that port, which could be like a front end to that, whatever interface we're connecting to with two-factor. We want to limit that exposure, again, reduce the amount of unnecessary exposure, clean up your certificates, clean up things that could identify your equipment behind the wire. Clutter, again, this is just typical housekeeping. We run into a lot of situations where instead of kind of trying to clean up and reduce the infrastructure size, we end up adding on and keep bolting on more technologies. So you end up getting kind of like an agent overload scenario, an equipment overload scenario, where we end up having, 2 or 3 different multi-factor, authenticators, and, maybe 2 or 3 different dynamic firewalls that are allowing, people to access assets, in their infrastructure, which could make things more complex in the long run. Generally we go on and we're trying to clean up and streamline things and make sure, like, 1, it's simple, and 2, it's very manageable and it's easy for people to use, and it prevents them from trying to do things like circumvent policy, because they have an easy system to use that they like, that's more secure, and it'll give them more, ability to manage those endpoints and those networks. So it goes through, making sure we have a way to configure these systems, making sure we can patch these systems, and making sure everything is consistent and normalized. So what in this slide, normalization basically is saying, I want a way for all my clients, all my people out there to go in and connect to my assets the same way and in a consistent way. So I don't have them using 3 different two-factor tools and, 3 different VPNs to do their job. So the Rube Goldberg example here just says, hey, we don't want additional complexity in the network, but we do want additional security. And this this is a ground up approach where we go in, we want to make sure that from the implementation phase, we want things to be streamlined. We don't want it to be difficult. We want to reduce as many additional pieces as possible. We don't want a lot of dependencies. So you want products that go in that don't require a lot of external controls that could add additional problems, right? We don't want to have a product that requires 3 Windows systems and 3 Linux systems and requires multiple disciplines to deploy. Agent overload, the same thing, right? We could be on a desktop computer or on an iPad or anything like that. And, if we need to have 2 or 3 separate agents to pass assertion to maybe a firewall or a controller, that could be a situation that introduces an unnecessary level of complexity, where we could just treat that device as untrusted and have good engineering and good software that secures these systems and gives us a level of auditing and control that makes everybody comfortable. Cloud exposures, as we move towards cloud management systems, we need to make sure, like, when we deploy an interface in the cloud, that if we connect that OT infrastructure to that cloud interface, how do we do that? How do we make sure that we're doing it in a way that does not expose that OT network and it keeps that network safe, no matter what, and keeps each of those assets individually safe? And Latency also is a big problem too, right? We work with a lot of networks that have terrestrial connections, terrestrial wireless connections, or even satellite connections. So we need to have something that works well over all of these scenarios. So just a plug for what we do at Xona is we offer a plug and play product that offers simplified deployment that's engineered from the ground up for zero trust and for mitigation of these concerns. So we want to go in there and plug in and help you simplify your architecture, and not necessarily rip and replace, but add something to it that can help give you a pathway forward. To implement, I was just looking at the questions. So just adopting zero trust, it takes time to adopt zero trust. We want to provide a solution for you that will let you progress forward into the advanced stage, into a more secure environment. You don't want to rip and replace everything at once. That's not practical. People took a lot of time to build up what they have now, and we want to go in there and replace components of it and make sure that the transition is smooth and secure. One of the things to look out for too is, do the existing tools, or do any of your tools add any risk to your infrastructure? If they do, we need to evaluate and assess what we could do. Now, sometimes there are tools out there and pieces of software out there that we can't really secure. They could be inherently insecure. They could be legacy. The vendor that developed them could be gone. We want to provide a way to encapsulate that and make them usable again if necessary, or possibly come up with an alternative way to mitigate that tool or that software. So sometimes you're stuck in a scenario, right, where we have a piece of legacy equipment that costs millions of dollars and we can't really support the software anymore. We can kind of provide a wrapper around that and provide that connection wrapper to get to that software or to connect to that equipment in a secure manner. This could be through protocol isolation. This could be through our remote video interface. And what this does is it prevents that direct attack vector and that direct attack surface from happening. So that would help, goes back to fortifying your assets and keeping updated with the times. So some other things to consider, right? When we choose vendors and we go out, we want to look at companies, we want to look at people that have certifications. We want to make sure that they've done their due diligence and, making sure that they do meet all the high standards that are available, right? NERC CIP, FIPS, for cryptography. We don't want any, we don't want to use weak crypto. We don't want to use libraries that are exploitable. Other compliance mandates that might happen. There's a lot of concern nowadays with this, and it's just good to know that companies are looking out and doing their due diligence, making sure that their engineering department is aware of these and implementing them correctly. So when we say, does it meet zero trust requirements, this could be a little bit subjective, but in reality, we want to make sure that we treat whatever we're deploying as something that could be touched by an attacker or a bad actor, or even someone that could be simply making mistakes. So we want to make sure that it's hard enough to withstand the environment, and if it's not, we need to architect it in a way where we can put it in that right environment so it doesn't introduce any more risk. And that's again where we come in, and we like to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. We like to take these legacy components, these legacy OT components, and provide a mechanism to connect to them securely and provide that two-factor, provide those FIPS 140-2 tunnels, provide your NERC CIP compliance to something that might not have it already. So going back to the castle analogy, right? We want to secure the castle, we want to secure the crown jewels, but we also want to you need to look at them, right? So you could look at it from the perspective of, we're kind of putting up a big pane of glass in front of this and allowing you to manipulate what's inside there without actually touching it directly. And, by providing these services available, this is enabling you to evolve your current architecture into a more zero trust environment. So when we're talking about like patching, that's like secure file transfer, right? I want to be able to securely transfer files from one place to another, but we're not directly transferring the file to that asset as in a typical manner, right? That asset doesn't really know where that file originally came from. It knows it came from one of our devices, and that file was vetted and tested on our device and then sent over from the inside. So this is important because a lot of these devices aren't really connected to the internet, but we're controlling them through, an internet facing connection at some point. Making sure, our configuration is secure, making sure log collection is happening. This is really important. We want to make sure we have high fidelity logs. We want to make sure we have as much data as possible, because in case there is an incident, we'll have all that available to us. And, network segmentation, again, this is a key component, right? We want to keep things separated. We want to make sure everything's connecting to what it should connect to and only what it needs to connect to. And especially when we're talking about people coming in externally to connect to an asset. Again, keeping asset inventories, roles and responsibilities, right? We want to provide a detailed role-based access to each user. I have engineers in the field that may need access to a certain type of HMI, where my administrators on the back end who are patching these need a different level of access to these. So we want to make sure, like, okay, my engineer doesn't have patch access. I need to prevent that patch access from occurring. Training also. So we enable training. We could record sessions for folks. We could have basically when they're in the HMI and controlling it, these devices that don't have any recording capability built in, they're quite simple. I don't want to name any like specific vendors. They all do a really good job of what they do, but the hardware and the equipment is just not set up for like video recording and such. So it's really difficult to get, training material out of them. With us, we enable that by default. So when you're connecting through our equipment, that's all recorded, and you can do screen sharing and that's provided to you. Incident response, again, this goes back to the auditing scenario, right? We want to provide as much data to you as possible, so you can have those logs. You can even have the video recording of where the clicks happened. So even if there wasn't a IT level security incident, let's say someone went in there and changed the parameters on, a turbine or, a windmill or anything like that, we would have that video of that. And we'd be able to go back and look at when that happened. Maybe a typo happened. And we need to go back and find out like who was accountable for that and when, maybe who gave access to this contractor who came in and did the change. So that's the root of that, requirement. So some of the takeaways, right? When we go in and design these systems, we want to make sure that we're meeting your mission needs, and, we're providing a more streamlined approach. We want to make things easier for you. We want to make sure that, we architect from the inside out. So we kind of start at the lowest, weakest link and build out from there. And then we could basically say, hey, we know we've reduced our attack surface down to this small piece, and now we can secure the paths that access those pieces. We want to determine the roles. We want to determine who needs access to what and when. So this could be, possible scenario like we don't provide permanent access to people. Maybe we just provide temporary access to folks, whereas some people might need permanent access. Again, just you need to have a flexible platform to do this. And we also want it, simple, so we don't end up moving backwards, right? We don't want to add anything to the environment that will overcomplicate it or reduce your certification level. So we want to select technologies that are always, zero trustworthy and always have, strong vendors, and strong technology and engineering behind them. So I just kind of repeating what we already talked about, though, is we're protecting these assets in a way that completely separates them from the external network. So, and we want to provide a higher level of security to it. So an example would be maybe we have a management interface that we could connect to via serial or a secure shell or VNC. We could take that connection, which is typically unencrypted on a lot of these devices, and doesn't have very good password length support or very good cryptography support. We could take that and make that one-to-one connection with that device, and then improve that, and then provide a view to that device and a control to that device that meets the certification requirements necessary. And we do this in a way where we basically have a device that can plug into the infrastructure. It's easy to set up, and it does its job, connects to the device, it creates a profile that you need, and then gives you access at these, at the level you need, without having to go in and do anything, overly complicated at a lower level. We see a lot of folks that go in and they want to, re-engineer the entire network, put tunnels in. They want to put, higher cryptography, the hardware devices in, which is fine if you need that. But we're providing a very simple approach to that and solving a very complicated problem in a plug and play manner. So we have a few different technologies built in. We have protocol and system isolation, which is basically saying, you're not directly accessing any of these protocols on the HMI. You're connecting through us. The connection is terminated, and then it's being rebuilt and reconnected on the back end. So there's no direct connection. It's the same thing with file transfer. There's no direct file transfer. We're moderating that. We're going through. The file transfer happens. The user would upload it to our device, and then from the HMI side, they would download it in a secure manner from our device also. And everything's explicit. The waiting rooms, again, this is something, this is a feature that could allow explicit access to a guest. And, they could come in, they could call in, they could say, hey, I'm waiting for access to get into the system. Can you grant me access? Yes. And the admin just needs to go into the waiting room and authorize them. Multi-factor, everybody uses multi-factor now. If a product doesn't support it, it usually should. There's a few different ways of doing this. We generally go to OTP, which means one-time password, and it works offline, without internet access, and it works with our hardware keys, our YubiKeys that we use. And policy management and protocol translation are the last major items that we like to cover. And again, you need good policy management, you need good role-based access. And you also need to prepare for the future, right? With protocol translation. We have instances where we need to take Modbus devices, and we need to create a secure Modbus, method of connecting to control software. I wanted to open up for questions and answers. That's all I had today for today's briefing. I'll be watching the chat. So feel free to enter.
Great.
Nima, I'll pass it on to you.
Yeah, Peter, looks like we have a couple, actually quite a few questions here. First question that came up was, is there an accurate definition for zero trust or IT and for zero trust and OT?
So that's an interesting question, because I talk to a lot of different customers, and zero trust means something different for a lot of different folks. For us, zero trust is defined as basically being able to have anybody connect to our product and provide a level of security that gives us assurance that the product is securing it, and in a way where we could basically know that our assets are being managed by the right devices. So what I'm saying is, above us, from when the clients connect in, they might be using Internet Explorer, they might be using Firefox, they might be using Chrome, they might be using whatever browser on whatever platform they want. We don't really we inherently just distrust all of that, right? We say, hey, whatever platform's coming in, we'll take care of it. And we're going to take that and wrap it in our wrapper from the CSG, which is the Xona appliance, out. And from the inside, that OT device is going to be, we're just going to assume it's insecure. These things don't have, they're not patched. They're hardly ever patched. The security is not the highest on a lot of these devices. They could be older devices. And we're just going to say, hey, let's just assume that back end tunnel is the vulnerable area, right? It's trusted, but it's the vulnerable, right? Because that's where we're at. So I would say that it's not like very accurately defined right now, but we're defining it as we go by making that, that mentality of don't trust anything. And I think that's what it really comes down to. Hopefully that answered the question. Yeah. So Corey, how are external user accounts managed with Xona, Azure, LDAP, AD, and local? So we are able to provide, we provide integrations and connections to external services. So we do have an LDAP, connector we can integrate with AD, and we have local authentication also. And we also use, YubiKey, one-time passwords. So we can use those also. So if it's a pretty standard authentication mechanisms that we support. With Azure, I would say, we support LDAP and AD and one-time password now, but for anything else, we definitely would like to talk about it and kind of see what kind of support you actually are looking for. Like if it's just an assertion pass from like a SAML server or anything like that, we could definitely make sure that that's supported. Great.
One more question or a couple more questions we have here.
Okay.
Actually, there's a follow-up question to that. What is the recording history max length storage? Video takes a lot of space. Is it video or screenshots being taken for the record?
Well, actually, we use a special format in the back end before the video is taken, and then we encode the video into a standard format like MP4. So this really depends on what we're looking at and what storage is available. So for instance, if I'm in an HMI and it's a very simple interface with like a gray background and no animation, it's just we're typing in, parameters, that hardly uses any video storage. You can record it for hours. The way the compression algorithm works is it looks for changes, and as changes occur, that's usually when the video increases in size. So simple, most of these are very simple devices that we connect to. However, during our testing, we'll connect to like maybe a video stream or anything like that, and that's going to fill it up a little bit more. It varies how much space it uses and how well the compression algorithm is working with the type of video it is. Happy to get into it a little bit more. If you had technical questions, definitely shoot us an email, and I could get you some like a table of some example sizes of what it would take.
Awesome. Peter, another question here. How do you work with other vendors that are providing similar or related functionality?
Yeah, so when we go into an environment and we look at other vendors, it's possible that they might have an older zero trust solution or an older solution that provides two-factor or anything like that. We'll go in there and we'll try to be like a plug-in. And generally, I like to go in. I don't want to go in and say, hey, we got to rip and replace all of this. I want to work with the vendors that are already there and possibly give them a path forward to either moving on from those older systems or working with them in conjunction with them to provide them a higher level of security. Sometimes it makes no sense to pull out these older systems if the infrastructures are already in place and working well. They just need an additional level of security. Maybe they have a system in place without two-factor. We could provide the two-factor, or they have a system in place that provides like real clunky access. I ran into someone, they would actually go on their VPN on one of their laptops, and they had to use a specific laptop. They couldn't use an iPad or anything. They had to use a specific VPN to get into the entry network. And then they had to RDP from that network to an internal system, like another jump host, and then use two-factor from there to get into the OT asset that they wanted. So it was very complicated for them. And we're able to go in there and provide another pathway to secure that, and two, a much simpler pathway into that network, and provide multiple device support on the client side. So now they could take like their iPad and go out and have more people connect to that asset and have a higher level of comfort.
Do vendors have to stop at the virtual wait room, or can they also pass through the pending configuration of Zona Management?
So this is optional. This is going to be on a per user basis. So it'll be like, that's really defined by you and how you want to manage the users.
Awesome. Another question here. What are the challenges in implementing zero trust in OT specifically?
So some of the main challenges that we run into are just environments that are quite old, where I don't want to say old, but they use old techniques to secure the system. So I'd say the biggest challenge is going in there and figuring out the main architecture and mapping everything out and figuring out where we need to place our devices in line. And unfortunately, I mean, a lot of times, right, we run into a lot of folks that they still have to go out. They have to drive a truck out to the site. They have to connect in. We need to make sure that we're able to provide those mechanisms for them to get in and make sure that they're able to connect and get to the level of security they need to, because it's not always trivial, right, to convince people like, hey, just throw this in and connect through the internet or connect through your other network, right? Because we have to bridge that IT and OT gap at some point.
Perfect. Peter, do you have a drawing to share of your Zona interconnection point? Does it come into the corp IT side or more direct to the OT side?
Yeah, so this would depend on the customer, right? So we have a lot of customers that, they might be, their OT networks and IT networks are completely separate, and we don't have any dependency on the IT side unless you explicitly want to connect it. So we could still operate completely on the OT side of the network and provide the same level of security, right? Our appliance runs completely independently. So you could connect to it, you could get two-factor, everything. Now, if you do want to bridge it and do want the IT bridge, that's supported also. I don't have a diagram right now, but I'd be happy to share it to you if you shoot us an email.
Yep, perfect. Corey, I'll send that over to you. Another question here. Peter, as chief architect, where would you start? What would be the first thing you do to adopt this zero trust architecture?
Yeah, the first thing we do is we like to go in and map out and get a whiteboard going. Let's figure out what we need to do, what we need to secure, what requirements do we need to meet with the customer. Everybody comes to us usually with some sort of I don't like to use the word trouble, but they come to us with something they want to change or improve. And that starts by getting a map of everything, getting an inventory of all the assets, and seeing where we're at today. And that depends on where we're going to put, our technology to improve it, and where we're going to kind of make the hard line cut of OT, that OT network that's untrusted.
Peter, can you install apps on the Zona system? Or is it really an access method to drop vendors on a jump box or engineering station?
Yeah, so it's not we don't run apps on our platform. Our platform is the app. So we can integrate with other technologies, but it really is an access method. And you could look at it like a jump box, and it's a jump box with a lot of additional technology bolted onto it, additional authentication technology and crypto technology built onto it with that isolation built in.
Great. That looks like it summed up a majority
Now,
of our questions there. Go ahead,
yeah,
Peter.
yeah. I just wanted to say, just kind of piling onto that one though, it's we can connect to specific applications, and we do have some folks do that where it presents a remote app on an HMI as if it was locally displayed or as if it was an app, but we don't actually run that app in our environment.
Perfect. Any more questions from the group?
I think we had, do we have any more?
I think that's all of them. Well, thank you so much, Peter. It looks like as we bring our Demystifying Zero Trust forum to a close here, we just once again wanted to thank you for allowing us to be here with you this afternoon or morning, wherever in the world you guys are, and hope that this webinar has given you a much clearer understanding of reducing the risk and improving governance of all access and actions performed. I'll be reaching out in the coming days to see if there are any outstanding questions for Peter. Make sure those get answered. And also, if you'd like a copy of the presentation slide deck, reach out to me. I'll definitely get that over to you. Keep in mind, this webinar will also be available on our website if you'd like to refer to it anytime. Again, if you have any questions or would like to meet with the team here at Zona, please email me directly. I'm reachable at Nima, N-I-M-A, at Zona Systems, Xona systems.com, or via LinkedIn. Once again, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today.